Okay, so we are here at the Zero Books basement discussing Capital Group. This is a Doug-approved title, we want to confirm. And we're here doing Chapter 12 of Volume 1 of Capital, the concept of relative surplus value. So that's what we'll be discussing today. We've posted the StreamYard. Will be going out. We're on StreamYard now. That'll be going out to Zero's official Twitch page, as well as Elliot Rosenstock's YouTube page. Elliot, what's your handle for that?
Sorry, give me 1 second there. I'm having a little audio issue on my end, but not on the stream end. Because in my end, all the streams are running, and so the audio is a little delayed from the Zero stream.
Yeah, Greg and I have been working out.
Let's see. You guys can start up, but I just need, I need 1 second.
So just we'll go to the chapter, the concept of relative surplus value. It's a short one, but I think it's one that has a lot of interesting aspects and problems that certainly are worth discussing. Does anyone have any thoughts on the chapter to start?
I think that this is the real chapter where some of the most tangible enumerations of how capital flows really begins, in terms of the relationship between what the worker is producing and what the capitalist is receiving. It's definitely the most theorized of many of the chapters here. Really sets the template for following formulae later on. We get
for sure.
ABC set up. AB delta and B to C set up for the transition from absolute surplus value production to improving relative surplus value production.
Yeah, for sure. I know Greg loves those. Greg, I know you love the math parts, right? This is I should have paid more attention. I should have paid more attention in high school math, right? There you go. Just applied math, right? Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting about this is the way that I mean, there's really, again, when I talk about the difficulty of applying these schemas, like there's really no way to uniformly infer what the necessary result is going to be, right? So we see on one hand that, you have the possibility of reducing the necessary labor time through the, increasing relative surplus value, in other words, through essentially automation, right? Or increasing the ratio of constant capital. But then this, like, paradoxically has the consequence, right? Like, Marx points out here, I'm trying to go. On the other end, however, this extra surplus value vanishes as soon as the new method of production is generalized, for then the difference between the individual value of the cheapened commodity and its social value vanishes, right? And then, further, and this is actually really important, Marx says, the general rate of surplus value is therefore ultimately affected by the whole process only when the increase in the productivity of labor has seized upon those branches of production and cheapened those commodities that contribute toward the necessary means of subsistence and are therefore elements of the value of labor power, right? So again, right, we see it's like, okay, well, it's like you can increase relative surplus value, and one would imagine profit as a consequence of that, but then that is going to vaporize, right? As soon as these technological methods, let's say, become generalized, right? And then so their primary impact in that case would be on how they affect the necessary means that it requires to actually create labor power, right? Like the commodities that the labor has to consume in order to live, in other words, right? But then that itself, right? I think I'm not sure exactly, there's other parts in this book where like even the fixity of that consequence itself ends up being challenged because Marx talks about the differentiation of social needs, right? In different contexts. So like, he says, I think at one point, to give like a very superficial kind of thing, he says like, beer for the English proletariat, wine for the French proletariat, which already acknowledges this difference to say that like the commodities that reproduce labor power, right, aren't necessarily the same, right? But also we should note that they vary in terms of how many of them are expected, right? So it's like in the West, like pretty much having a smartphone, right, is effectively like obligatory, right, for the performance of a lot of forms of work. But there are certainly environments where that's not the case. So if, and that's about class struggle, right? Like that's very clear.
How so, Conrad? How is that about class struggle?
Well,
that's obligatory. It is universal, right? Obligatory cell phone.
Well,
really?
I'm just, by the way, I'm just laying out. By the way, quick note for you, Elliot. So have we put a link for passive observation of the thing as well in the Capital group or in the?
So we have the YouTube, have the Facebook, we have Twitch.
Okay, but is that linked to through the group so people can join?
Yeah.
As
so
well?
the group has it.
Okay, and then inside the event we have
the event has the StreamYard. Hi, Revilo.
Hey, Revilo.
Yeah, I might. I don't know really if I can. I'm listening to the conversation, trying to gauge whether I can really add anything. Doesn't sound like I could, So
go for it. Take a shot, man. Take a shot. Why not?
I'm actually kind of lost into what page are we on? Like, I'm looking at the production of relative surplus value, and I can't seem to.
Sorry, I should say the pages. Yeah, I didn't say the page. 436.
The translation too.
Yeah, 436, and it's the folks. It's the folks Penguin Classics, and it's page.
Okay, can we talk about how Marx reads Hegel badly? Because Marx says, this is what he says: the surplus value produced by a prolongation of working day, I call absolute surplus value. That's not what an absolute. That's not like what an absolute means. But it's like imagine if somebody said that in here, no, they'd be like, that's not what that absolute means. One, it's okay, and then secondly, so what? Even if you didn't know what he meant, so it's I don't know. Sometimes I feel like Marx sometimes gets into these really bad Hegel. I feel like Hegel was interesting, but he was very complicated, and then you have to figure out what it means by the terms. But it seems like Marx just sort of peppers the terms. He likes to pepper the Hegelian terms and not use them properly. It's he turned Hegel on his head. It's really, because that doesn't mean anything. Yeah. Absolute surplus, that doesn't mean. On the other hand, the surplus value arising from the curtailment of necessary labor time and from corresponding alteration in the respective lengths of the two components of the working day, I call relative surplus value.
Yeah, so chronologically, by the way, this is structural, but chronologically, lengthening the working day is more characteristic of pre-capitalist formations, whereas focusing on increasing labor productivity is more characteristic of capitalist formations, right? But actually, even within capitalism, there's a difference because, if you look at, let's say, the service industry, right, which is lower in constant capital investment. I think we talked about this a bit last time. It's more about the production of absolute surplus value in a lot of ways than relative surplus value, which is why there's so much kind of constant harassment, right? If you're a server or something, to, sort of hurry up, right, work more hours and so on. Right.
Okay. I don't know. So we can go on from there, I guess. He says, in order to affect the fall of labor power, the increase in the productiveness of labor must seize upon those branches of industry whose products determine the value of labor power, and consequently either belong to the class of customary means of subsistence or are capable of supplying the place of those means.
Where is this? What do you say?
That's the sentence right after absolute and relative. I don't know what page. I'm reading from.
Yeah. So going. Okay. Yeah. Okay. In order to make the value of labor power go down. Yeah. Yeah. But okay. So I was saying.
Yeah. The more I read Marx, the more sympathy I have for vulgar social democracy and Bernie Bros, because I feel how important. A lot of Marxists talk about
I gotta get a cigarette.
Conrad's leaving. Conrad's he's had it. He's had it.
I tried to get a smoke before you kept talking. Like,
Oh yeah, sorry. I thought you were leaving and
no, I just needed a cigarette if you're going to say that.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
You're going to shoot
Sorry.
me or something.
Yeah, so he yeah, so I have more sympathy with vulgar social democracy because, you know, they get a lot of critique for being hysteric about sort of the issues of the time and then seeing more of the state. But that sort of like makes sense. And it's like, oh no, did this just, all right, hold on. Sorry, I doubled my audio again. It's so easy to like click the wrong button and do that. Then I feel like Marx goes on and on about like, okay, here's the dynamic. If you increase labor time, you can produce more in a factory. Yeah, of course you fucking can. If you, if it costs a lot, the stuff in your factory costs a lot. That changes the value of it. Yeah. Okay. So like, okay. So what?
Wait, did you just say if the stuff in your factory? Wait. I would make a correction. If the stuff in your factory.
Okay, please do. Please make a correction.
Okay. Well. Okay, what do you mean the stuff in your factory? Do you mean like, are you talking about constant capital?
So like the means of production, if the goods produced by the means of production are worth more, then the value goes up. Like in terms of, like, in order to determine the labor power, the productiveness of labor must seize upon the branch of industry whose products determine the value of labor. So the product, whatever the product.
That would be the product, though. That wouldn't be the means of production, because
So
actually,
yeah.
But
I know, but I'm bringing in. I know it's fragmented in his writing, but I'm just bringing in the fact that there's already a means of production there.
Okay, but that's paradoxical. Happening. Elliot, wait, let me finish. That's paradoxical because actually,
looking at it disjointed is not paradoxical. It's just like the question
is productivity. Productivity, not value. But let's say like if you invest in a lot of new like constant capital that increases productivity, that actually lowers the value of goods, right? Which makes labor power cheaper, right?
And yeah, so what Conrad is trying to get at is if you look at the entire working day and he breaks it up into a first portion of socially necessary labor, which is just the amount of labor that has been expended in order for the worker to reproduce himself and his necessities through his daily life. So what the capitalist has to do in order to extract more surplus value without lengthening the day, without an extension of the working day, is that whatever products are produced that the laborer needs to actually consume through his socially necessary labor, that is the stuff that he is dependent on for the necessities of life.
Yeah. That's all fucking rhetoric.
It's that class. It's that class of product that needs to be made more efficiently in order for the value of labor power to fall, so that instead of lengthening the actual working day, they can get more surplus value as opposed to socially necessary.
Well, of course. So to sum up what you're saying is that when
it's an adjustment of the ratio.
When the machines become more efficient, you need less labor. That doesn't necessarily tell you.
Yeah, it's making
there's less.
More efficient production of the commodities that are necessary for the laborer's life, not just any commodities in general.
I know but I didn't say commodities in general, but I'm trying to distill it in really
just to
simple
separate,
form,
to parse.
Because I think it's presented, or the way it's sort of gone through traditionally is in this fragmented way. But I think the question you also have to ask is like, so what's the significance of this? Or like, so what? So then it's like, you know,
well,
okay, so your machines become more like. Let me just finish this thought, like, before you go and defend what I think is a fucking really simplistic sort of statement.
Well, I'm not
which
saying
is like, let me. So it's like, let me get the idea out. So the machines in the factory become more efficient. And then it requires less labor time, or you produce more of the product, right? Okay, so what's the significance? What's the significance of this, or like what should be done about this, or how does this fit in with labor theory of value and all that?
The implication is that with a finite amount of time, you're able to get more goods out, and so you can increase the rate of surplus value production. It's not just about making things cheaper. It's about apportioning more profit-making time in the day to the point where more of that goes to the capitalist rather than merely serving the function of keeping the laborer's daily necessities coming alive.
Okay, yes. As machines get more
altering that
efficient.
ratio.
Yeah, okay. So the ratio alters when the machine becomes
say
more
you have
efficient.
say you have
So
an
this is
8-hour
true.
day.
Okay.
So say you have an 8-hour day, and 5 of those hours are necessary for the worker to reproduce his daily necessities in order to keep living. You have a ratio of 5 hours that the worker has to work in order to keep himself sustained, and then 3 hours that the capitalist is getting surplus value. What the improvement in the efficiency of the production of the commodities that the labor is dependent on does is reduce that time that they need to work to sustain themselves, say down to maybe 4 hours out of an 8-hour shift. And then the capitalist has now gained another hour of surplus value production time, thereby increasing it by 33%, as opposed to 3 hours a day to 4 hours a day going towards his.
Okay, so the capitalist, once technology improves, the money doesn't go to people but to the capitalist. That's an important point.
In a sense, I wouldn't say money, yeah, but like value production.
I know he's with Marx with his fucking exact definition of money. Okay.
Well, money is not value.
We
have to remember that as well.
So well, let's just say generally, no.
The appearance,
the currency.
Unless you're Piero Strappian.
So technology improves, right? So this is happening today. Technology is improving. When technology improves, that doesn't mean quality of life improves.
No, not necessarily.
Because the person who gets the money from the technology improving is the capitalist,
so
like Musk.
It doesn't necessarily mean, but that's why I brought in class struggle.
Yeah,
right?
because on technology improving in the sectors that contribute to the laborer's life sustenance.
So this is why I brought in
order for the value of labor to fall.
Yeah, this is why I brought in class struggle, because like, so this is neither here nor there once you have like a generalization of like these more efficient forms of technology to all kinds of different firms, right? Because like they're all competing on the same basis, right? But Marx says in that context, right, like the way that it would actually help would be by reducing the value of labor power in the form of the commodities necessary to reproduce labor power. But how much what the social needs of laborers are is a basis of class struggle, right? So if you have more pressure, in other words, to redistribute wealth, right, from capital accumulation, right, to the working class, right, to basically say like, okay, we're going to let you have a bigger home, you can have a car, smartphone, or whatever, right? Then that decreases, right, the degree to which capitalists are going to benefit from that, because it means that basically a share of the what capitalists would otherwise use just to reduce the value of labor power, the value of labor power is then increasing, right, because of demands that have been made by the working class. Yeah.
So you can get a higher minimum threshold for the necessary reproduction of labor, or you can lower it by improving the productivity of what those goods are that are necessary for the reproduction. That's how you depress the value of labor, so that then you can increase the apportionment of surplus value production from the day relative to what the worker has to work for himself.
Yeah, so the argument of social democracy usually would be like that we can keep capitalism going, but that we should basically try to increase the social needs of the worker, right? In tandem with the increases in productive efficiency of capitalism. Right?
So how does okay.
There's a second threat to that too, though. One of the threats to that is that the value of labor power falls so much that the worker can no longer actually sustain himself on the value of his labor. They end up having to work much longer than they can actually do to reproduce their labor power, and then that's when you come into a crisis of the reserve army of employment.
Okay.
So let's requires a balancing act in that.
Let me read this really quickly. The shortening of the working day is therefore by no means what is aimed at in capitalist production when labor is economized by increasing its productiveness. It is only the shortening of labor time necessary for the production of a definite quantity of commodities that's aimed at. So Marx is saying the improvement of working conditions is not incentivized by the factory owner, only the shortening of the technological gap to produce a certain product.
The increasing of the productivity of labor.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The fact that the workman, when the productiveness of his labor has been increased, produces, say, 10 times as many commodities as before, and thus spends 1/10 as much labor time on each, by no means prevents him from continuing to work 12 hours before, or from producing in the 12 hours 1,200 articles instead of 120. Nay, more, his working day may be prolonged at the same time, so as to make him produce, say, 1,400 articles in 14 hours. In the treatises, therefore, economists of the stance of McClellan, Ussr, Senior, and tutti quanti the like, we may read upon one page that the laborer owes a debt of gratitude to capital for developing his productiveness. So he's saying technology improvement is not a boon for the laborer, and so the laborer shouldn't be excited that the technology boom will make his job easier.
Well, it could be like, so the schema is not deterministically applied, right? And that's what I was saying is the trickiness of it.
Yeah.
So actually, like, for example, it would seem to be clear that in the middle of the 20th century, that a lot of the increase in productivity were leveraged to actually increase, let's say, the social requirements of the reproduction of labor in such a way that made workers to some extent beneficiaries of that system. And that's still, like, partly the case, especially in any developed country, right, where there's, like, I was going to say Medicare, but I know you're from America. Where usually there's, Medicare and welfare and things like this, public libraries, whatever. Which also, let's be honest, like, a lot of that also has to do with, it's not just like, it's not, a lot of the lines of agreement between the bourgeois and the proletarian are on things that, let's say, could enhance the quality of life of the proletariat, but could also serve as useful in terms of enhancing the efficiency of the labor that's actually reproduced. And education, right, is a very good example of that.
Yeah. Okay.
So education raises the minimum threshold, if you will, of the socially necessary labor time, because all of that education gets factored into the value of your labor when you enter the workforce. So if you end up raising the minimum socially necessary requirements, then the value of labor power gets pushed up. But if you can cheapen the production of that, then the value of labor power gets pushed down.
So I have a question for you guys. Do you think that technological improvement happens in such a universal global sense that despite this tendency, well, I think Marx himself would answer yes. Despite this tendency, quality of life for the laborer can get better, or maybe he wouldn't answer yes.
I don't think he'd answer that question.
Yeah.
Like, but what he saw was that in places where his tendency is actually to think that his, like, tendency, right, in terms of how he characterizes capitalism, is to say that it makes life worse. Right. But then actually, if you explore, like, the more precise formulas in the book, that's not deterministic. Right. So that's a lot of what people have to do, like, in a post-war context when they're trying to understand, how obviously in certain parts of the world anyway, quality of life had risen a great deal. A lot of what they had to do was to go back to the more precise formulations and try to understand them, as opposed to, like, the more rhetorical bursts.
From the StreamYard comments, which gives me the comments from everywhere, there's someone on Facebook that says, "Where are the women?" in the discussion. Should I give her the stream? Should I post the StreamYard link for them?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Say you can join.
I mean, Gabriella said she would join, but she's her level of English she was worried about because she's from Greece, so she was concerned that she wouldn't be able to keep up.
It's up to her, it's no problem. I'm gonna post.
And I appreciate Ernesto, by the way. I appreciate Ernesto engaging, because I know often we speak very fast and it's very complicated. So I know maybe your English is obviously very good, but I know that can be tricky as well. So I appreciate that you're here doing this with us.
Thank you. I'm trying to follow along.
And Ernesto, by the way, do you have any thoughts? And Ervilo, you guys haven't weighed in too much. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I was thinking about countries where there's a big difference in minimum wage north of the border and south of the border here between Mexico and the United States. And one of the reasons that I've heard said a lot publicly is that we have a Medicare kind of deal. We have a social security. We have a national social security, right? And what I keep hearing is that that's why our wages are so low. And after what we've been reading, it makes a lot of sense, because if people don't have to pay for the cost of their own healthcare, I guess they don't really need that much money at all.
Well, you need food. You need that
Yeah.
could be. You could say that's a bourgeois class
Yeah.
propaganda piece. No,
Exactly,
Be like, well,
exactly.
your wages are low because we give you social democracy.
Yeah, exactly. And it's what I keep hearing here in Mexico.
That's an
and
ugly side of social democracy.
It's terrible.
Really.
Yeah.
But it is connected, right? Because if Medicare, usually public Medicare delivery is more efficient. So like I know in the States, like it's not like the States, it's more disparate, but like the general quality of Medicare in the States is not, let's say, as a social average, it's not worse than Canada. It's just that it costs twice as much to deliver, right? So if you actually streamline these things, right, and you make delivery more efficient, then you can argue that also that would actually have a consequence of reproducing or lowering the value of labor power, which would make it easier in capitalism that way. And that's actually that was actually even of communism, right? That was Tronti's critique in Workers and Capital, right? Tronti's critique of the Italian Communist Party was that it has basically become, it no longer opposes itself to capital, it's just complicit in capital accumulation. So it's trying to essentially acquire like a larger part for the working class. And because of that, it erects barriers between mass and class and party. And like you can see the same thing in China, right? Where, the Chinese Communist Party has ceased committing itself to a more visceral kind of revolutionary agenda, and has just basically made itself into a political vehicle to advocate for the accumulation of capital and the redistribution of enough of it to workers that, political peace is maintained, let's say. Right.
Well, one of the big differences between social democracy and Marx, it seems like, which is coming out clearly here, is social democracy says the state will provide you what you need, versus Marx says, well, no, technology will make it so that capital is accumulated and you don't actually get the benefits. So people like complain about Marxists about being workerists or something like that, or like use it as a slur. But I mean, I think one of the main arguments for a Marxist press in general, like Zero Books or something, as opposed to just being another sort of DSA vehicle, I think is there's this initial mistake, which is that the state getting bigger will automatically translate to your quality of life improving. That's not necessarily the case, because you do have to get into, even if it's difficult to do that with this, even if you can't do that with this, you just need a mechanism to somehow get the value of labor to workers' hands, right?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, you're in the chat. You can interrupt. You could say "fuck you." You can do whatever you want.
I don't like you. Because you're all a bit smarter than me. But where do you think the idea that a bigger state equals some sort of fairer state comes from? I mean, I've heard this from a lot of people, including communists.
Well, directly you get Medicare. So Americans, like basic social democracy, you get, like other places already have this. You don't die of like a preventable disease if you have the technology to fix it. So that's like a basic idea of social democracy, right? There's a second one, which is education should be free. Yeah. Germany has both of those, right? But it doesn't necessarily guarantee people's quality of life is getting better. So that's like a sort of basic. But look at if you look at Mexico, I would say you have Medicare for everybody in Mexico.
If you have a job, yes.
If you have a job, so if you're unemployed, you can't get.
Yeah. I'm sure there's some health services, but the Seguro Social only takes people who have jobs.
Oh wow! So you have to prove that you have a job.
Yeah, I have to be employed.
Yeah, but this is a little bit. This is a bit falsifying, like to discuss historically, because like I'm pretty sure that there were some cases where you had like state expenditure purely as kind of, not even purely, but like largely as hypermilitarism, like Nazi Germany. But you know, in the vast majority of 20th century cases, right, where state expenditure has risen, right, which you could identify as being related to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and the problem of underconsumption, right? In almost every case, like the increasing of relative state expenditure goes hand in hand with the increasing of the quality of life of the citizenry, right? Like, you know, so actually, if you look at Mexico, right, like it's, you know, the countries with the highest ratios of state expenditure are, other than maybe like one or two very explicitly communist outliers, are basically all like the Western most developed countries,
Yeah.
right? So, you know, and that's because like the crisis of automation has been most acute in those areas, right? In other words, like the need to redistribute wealth to prevent a situation where nobody can actually buy goods, right? So I'm not sure if it's so easy to separate like the question of quality of life from the question of the size of the state. Like there are a few contingencies and complications, but especially on a historical and empirical level, I'm not so sure if the two are easy to separate. Like the United States has more state spending in relationship to its economy, its GDP, than China, right? Like, you know, and that seems kind of counterintuitive given that China is nominally communist. But again, I think the question more concerns level of development in many ways than it concerns nominal ideology, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's clearly not only the state that helps workers or is the task of socialism. So there is a project of socialism, which is generally getting goods and services from the state, but then there's this other one about labor value returning to the worker, which seems like no socialist state has really properly addressed so much. Maybe Cuba, I don't know. What do you think is
returning labor value?
Returning the capitalist doesn't accumulate. Sure. The person who owns the factory in, say, China accumulates value at an enormously higher rate than their workers, even in comparison to the U.S. So one could argue that worker conditions are better in the U.S. because your labor time is less, and you're, although from the Chinese state you receive more, right? Which is Mexico's problem as well, which is in Mexico, from the state you can receive potentially more than you would in the States, but you aren't getting the money back from your labor, or you're not. The labor, that money is being exported to, say, various capitalists.
Well, the problem is that the main problem is that like capitalism runs on value, not productivity, right? So this is actually the main problem, and those two terms you really have to differentiate them. The main problem is that like even if productivity levels rise, like in a developed country, again, like if you have like a generalization of these technologies, it's not as if that's necessarily creating the desired changes in the value that's being produced, right? So when you go to do things that redistribute the gains that are a consequence of increased productivity, right, that can actually depress the production of value in such a way that makes capitalism very hard to manage, right, in first world countries, right? So you've had those kind of acute crises in first world countries. I mean, you look at like the miners' strike in England was very much a case of this, where the actual feasibility of English firms on a capitalist terrain was, it's not just hyperbole, like it was actually legitimately challenged by, the gains of the workers' movement.
Daniel L. Jacobs says, worker does not equal proletariat. And Chapter 10 says, the fight over the working day is how the working class proletarianizes itself.
Okay. I don't disagree. I mean, worker and proletariat. I mean, Marx says proletariat is the universal class.
That's such idealism, though, isn't it? Should we call Marx on his idealism here in terms of you need the worker to have a sort of idealist sort of sense of itself before they can get their value back? Because I don't know if you meet with workers, but it's like that's not always necessarily. I mean, you might end up with a bit of a problem if you want every worker to study like theory and proletariat. I
don't think Marx gives a clear answer to that, but Alberto Toscano in one of his essays, what is it? The World is Already Without Us. He makes the point, and it's a point he takes from Jameson, that in like post-Fordist, whatever kind of Western countries, that Sometimes solidarity is more difficult to create because so many workers are either just like adjuncts to machines or they're basically superfluous. So, you know, I think that's one thing. But yeah, like Marx obviously has a very like Hegel's universal class of bureaucrats in the philosophy of right becomes for Marx like the universal class of the proletariat, right?
Mhm.
But there's like a great debate on what that means, right? As for the question of whether workers are proletariat, I mean, again, you can look at it in different ways. Like, what is the proletariat? Is it a specifically organized and spiritually united class, or does it refer to a more generic process through which people become wage laborers, right?
Yeah.
Well, we know that not all wage laborers can be included.
Daniel L. Jacobs said yes.
Management is an example.
Hopefully, we've satiated you, YouTube commenter, with that answer.
Greg?
Sorry, Greg. Go on.
I was just saying, well, we know that not all wage laborers would count because in fact, a lot of wage laborers are managers. Yeah. So they're still in a different role relative to the production of capital and surplus value. So there is some discernment that does go into categorizing that. And then there's also like the lumpen proletariat would not necessarily be considered part of them because they'd be working against proletarian interests. And then furthermore to that, there's another process of proletarianization, which is the de-skilling of the roles in these jobs and positions. So there's an active process of proletarianizing different roles within the economy, and that happens through the reduction of all of the skills necessary to do that role into atomized, discrete skills that are maybe used, you know, one at a time. For example, anytime you have something that formerly was a craft or required someone to be trained and apply all of their intellectual skill, well, when you introduce machines that do it for you and all you have to do is, you know, run the machine, that's the de-skilling of that industry. And that's another example of proletarianizing of that industry.
That's, I've got a limited understanding of this sort of thing, but that's interesting because I always imagined that the proletariat referred to workers who were skilled in some sense, like they were the necessary workers, to use a coronavirus term, you know, like they were the ones who kept things going, and worker was a more general term to refer to any working class person.
Well, working class does have a very distinct implication in UK, for example, but in Marx, what the proletarian would refer to does not include things like nurses or what we'd be
teachers.
Thinking of in terms of, I don't know about like Conrad. I don't know about teachers. You'd probably be better to weigh in on that because they contribute.
He explicitly says, I think he explicitly says that they're not. Well, we have to talk here about the distinction between productive and unproductive labor.
It's the role, it's the role that they play within production, as opposed to just like background, keeping things functioning. It's about the production of surplus value.
Yeah, the problem is that these distinctions become more supple in the context of like 20th century welfare capitalism. Because like Ben, when you have like a huge system of public Medicare, and you know that becomes absolutely essential to the reproduction of the labor force, like, you know, at that point, you know, this is always the problem, right, with this distinction of productive and unproductive, is that like, you know, even in Marx's time, I'm sure he was capable of identifying that there were some contradictions in it, but it becomes really fraught with contradictions when you have a whole society that's leveraged to service the production of capital, right? Which is what Jameson says, you know, is the problem we have like in the context of postmodernism, because postmodernism represents the point where the purging of kind of pre-capitalist formations doesn't give us any point of reference even to understand capitalism itself. So like everything is absorbed, right? Like, and you could just say like, he talks about the clash, I think, right? The way that like their protest gets reabsorbed into capitalism.
Did we ever answer this question? Where are the women? Can you see?
Does Courtney want to come on? Because she can't complain about it if she's not willing to rap.
Yeah. Courtney, come on the stream. We have, you know, we're more than happy to include a feminine voice in this.
Yeah, I mean, maybe our culture is
Marx reading groups tend to be heavily male, I think.
Typically. Wait, I have a Jordan Peterson take on this. Well,
what's your Jordan Peterson take?
maybe it's
Oh,
because
no.
women just aren't interested in Marx. You know, back when people were still hunting and gathering, you know, this is not the kind of thing women would have been studying back then.
Ernesto, can
Perhaps
you read a
it's
comment
not-
in Spanish?
It's
Yeah,
just
oh,
not
sorry.
in their background, you know?
Sure. Which one?
Can you read this one, Ernesto? From
Okay.
from Shimo on
I see
Facebook.
gringos. I recognize that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
chinguen a tu madre, gringos. Estados Unidos es por definición imperialista.
Yes. Okay. Chemo says, chinguen a su madre gringos. Estados Unidos es por definición imperialista. You know, go fuck yourself, gringos. United States is by definition an imperialist venture country. You know.
Well,
Does
you're
anyone
from, you know, you're in
anyone
Mexico,
disagree with that?
so
Yeah, I think everyone's on that
So-
page.
I know we're there. We're not. That's why we're doing a Marxist broadcast, because hypothetically we're against that, right? Right. That's the idea, I think. But thank you. Always
Yeah.
good to clarify.
Also, Elliot's Jewish. Elliot's Jewish, so he is subaltern, right? He's not part of the imperialist.
It's still
white
gringo.
patriarchy.
You're still gringo.
Hey, don't peddle idpol here, Conrad.
Ashkenazis are POCs. Only in academic discussions, but in the real world.
Well,
Ashkenazis are
that
white
is something I
people.
will say about her comment though. That is something like, you know, if you're
At least
analyzing
in
like
LA. Maybe it's
if you're
different.
analyzing the development of the United States, it is true that you have to understand like the really, really decisive role that working class movements played in creating the kind of economic dispensation that exists within the United States today, right? Which gets back to the question of social need and so forth. And it's not contradictory, right? Certainly historically, it's not contradictory that, you know, I mean, this was the big thing, you know, the trauma of, you know, the German Social Democratic Party supporting World War I, right? But it's not contradictory that working class movements should advance, you know, national imperialistic interests, right? We've seen plenty of examples of that before, right? I mean, the American Teamsters supported the invasion of Cuba, right? Because they were so connected with the mob that, you know,
Yeah.
that
Oh, yeah.
they were upset with Castro for, you know.
Revolutionizing production is revolutionizing the production of humans.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, Marx
It's
uses
a bit of a woke take,
revolutionizing
bit of a woke
production
take.
pretty freely. Like when you
I-
swap out machines, you revolutionize the production process. So I don't know if it's as grandiose as it sounds like when it's in the context of this right now. It's not like a political revolution.
Revolutionizing the production of humans. Yeah, I think that's like, but I think that Marx, again, like part of the reason that social reproduction theory emerges and commands the importance that it does is because it's probably under theorized in certain respects in the work of Marx and Engels. I mean, there are two ways of looking at this question, right? One way is like, you know, are you talking just about revolutionizing production in a context imminent to capitalism, or are you talking about what it would mean to achieve a revolution, you know, in a sort of communist horizon? You know, I think you can argue that both require, you know, certain very clear changes in the production of humans.
Hey, we have someone repping Shulamith here.
Yeah, Luke says Shulamith take.
Shulamith take. I talked about this on Zero Plateaus. The video's now been deleted. But I talked about what is it? Do you remember what I said about Firestone? What I said that her oh yeah, that the paradox of Firestone's work is that she basically sees like capitalist productivity in a communist context as being capable of abolishing like what she views as like the biologically painstaking nature of being a woman. But I just lightly criticized her for not taking into sufficient consideration the way that the trauma of the feminine condition, as it were, is a consequence of the particular structure of the family within the context of commodity producing society or capitalist society. Like, for example, okay, we have another question.
We do. The limit in Marx, says Kirsty, the limit in Marx's capital is the metaphors of conception / reproduction that structure it. Does that mean?
Well, I think he means reproduction pretty literally. like in terms of being able to work and then raise another child and also reproduce.
Does he use
your
reproduction in that
value
sense?
for what you can continue using to sustain yourself?
Does he use reproduction in that sense? Because he talks about the reproduction of capital and the reproduction of labor, but like it doesn't. It didn't. It doesn't.
Reproduction of life is included in that.
Okay. But I do agree. I do agree that that is like I think that is the limit to it, and I think, but I don't think that one has to. I think I don't think that one has to throw out the text either, because that I think there are ways of refining the analysis. I also think that like you could, if you really want to get trippy, which is what I kind of do in my thesis. I mean, you can ask the question of like, to what extent humanism, for example, as an ideology, which also plays a role in Marx's Capital, is a consequence of the centrality of surplus value extraction, right, within capitalism, which kind of brings you into like kind of like actor network potential sort of territory, or how you could, to that sort of territory, how you could pursue a rapprochement between like speculative realism and Marxism. Anyway, I'll stop now. So I'm just saying we shouldn't just think about, my point is we need to think about everything. I mean, not just obviously like, we have to think about it through the prism of race and gender, but also through the prism of, anthropocentrism to core, right? Especially in our age where, climate change is a very explicit consequence of capital accumulation. Satan forever.
Spice SXXX says Satan forever. Okay. Thank you, Spice.
Did they put that because Revelo looks like a metalhead? Is that why they put that there? I'm wondering. I don't know. I like Doom.
I don't know.
Are we just fielding? How many
Should this
people?
live stream have a? Should we have a theme song or something, like a background track?
Do. I don't know. I wonder if I could do that with this fucking shit.
Like the Duke Nukem 3D soundtrack.
I'm all about old shooter soundtracks. Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah. Okay. So Revelo, Ernesto, anyone? Do you have more thoughts on this?
I couldn't keep up with the conversation as it stands, so. But the quote about the revolutionizing the production of humans, it reminds me of I can't remember who said it, but like the as more machines enter humans' workplaces, the more human work becomes machine-like. And I can't remember who said that, but I used to think about that a lot, But as for this conversation, it's a bit heady for me.
Sounds like some situationist shit or something.
Probably.
That makes sense. That works on that. That's actually like you'd have to take that on two levels though, because like on one hand, we should actually get back to what you're saying about the proletariat and de-skilling. But like on one hand, like, okay, like the things that used to be done by humans, right, are taken over by the machine. So in a way, labor becomes, let's say, less machine-like in that retroactive sense. But in another sense, it becomes more machine-like because your job could just be like hitting, like like an assembly line. Like,
yeah.
So I think
atomized actions. Yeah.
Yeah, just like repetitive kind of production, right? But then that actually, where that falls apart, like that's good for what the fuck? You got like CNN style.
That's your future. The unknown big other just in with the signifiers.
Conrad, you've been interpolated.
Yeah, that's true. I've been interpolated. Yeah, like so, but then actually this kind of falls apart, like and so Negri has the category of effective labor. The problem is like the scale of the automation in the West has been such that a lot of the scale of automation in the West has been such that a lot of the jobs that now exist are precisely not machinic, right? So I mean, Negri talks about like feminized labor, whatever the fuck that means, effective labor. I mean, if we're talking about like caring for bodies or persons or service sector work or work that requires like, the application of the particular human personality, that becomes more common. So again, I think I get the point about that thing about work becoming more machine-like, but when you really run it through this whole grinder, it's a bit complicated too.
Yeah. It's a pretty unnuanced thing to say, I suppose, at the end of the day.
Well, I'm not saying it's wrong, right? It's just like, of course, like the goal of dialectic is to kind of acquire the whole, right? The totality. And, there's no kind of simple formulation that's going to get to that. Even Marx's Capital isn't going to get to that, By the way, Elliot, I also have an issue. Here's an issue with you. Something you brought up really early. Okay.
All right.
You disputed how many books? Anyone? Is that a question? I'm confused.
No, it's not a question actually.
I want to say quickly about zero. To me, the meaning of zero in Zero Books, originally it actually comes from, I think, something by Nick
Fisher.
Land.
Or
Fisher Qua Land, yeah. Qua Deleuze, I think.
Well, zero as the number of production as opposed to the one. What is your understanding?
My understanding of it, which is a bit different, my understanding of it, like the way I would argue it should be reinterpreted now, especially with all the stuff with Land, is that it is like you think of a film like Joker. It's kind of like the zero is what represents nothing. So it's like Zero Books is like what gives a kind of like identity, right, to like a kind of social nothingness that is otherwise unrepresented, right? That would be the way that I understand. Because when you have the number of zero, that symbolizes nothingness, right? Any thoughts on that? No? Okay. Steve Bro, tell me more. Also, because Zero Books is the total number of books that anyone should read. That's the other reason for it. We're anti-book learning. You said something. You said something earlier. Well, that's why you're here, of course, right? But you said something earlier, Elliot. You said that Marx fucks with like the Hegelian category of the absolute. That was your.
Yeah, he does. He does. Well, I think the use of it is just so different.
Okay.
I think in terms of the absolute I, the God I of spirit. But what you said about zero kind of makes me think of like Hegel's clearly a zero in that sense, in terms of the thing that is otherwise unrepresented.
Well, it's extra logical, right? Like Coletti in his book Marxism and Hegel, right? It's like the extra logical reality. But I just mean that, so Marx is differentiable from Hegel in his use of the absolute, but there are arguments about what the absolute might represent in Marxism. But I think what's clear is that for Marx, the absolute is not like a kind of philosophical notion in that way, but that the absolute actually is like a social totality that exists. And then you can kind of map that social totality in different ways. Like, is it the value form? Is it, the proletarian struggle or whatever? But the point is that for Marx, the absolute is something that is based in kind of the material structure of society. Like that's how it acquires its authority. And any kind of philosophical conceptualization of the absolute necessarily indexes to that, right? Which is what Hegel couldn't recognize about his own work. So Marx says at one point that like Hegel's, I don't know the exact quote, but like Hegel's logic is the logic of political economy or something like that, right? So the kind of sprawl and encompassing of everything that you find with dialectic in a way mirrors, right, the logic of political economy in that way.
Wait, I have a ticker for this.
I
love it.
Communicate entirely by that thing.
Yeah, ticker.
Yeah, you don't really need to follow the discussion. If you go off the Twitter, if you go off the what is it? What are those? So that's you, Elliot, making those?
That's me. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I wasn't sure if Doug had like hacked our screen.
No. That's what I said. This is your future, which is signifiers get presented to you, and you don't necessarily know who's controlling them. There's just sort of
that's a good theme, right? Because like isn't that the experience of postmodernism, right? Like because like Timpanaro talks about this. Postmodernism is like it's like everything. Like we just have all these signifiers, right? We can't see the base for the superstructure. Everything's like signification. We can't separate ourselves from capitalism or map it. right?
Yeah.
So in a way, like this experience that I have, like I'm in Paris, you know, broadcasting through here, not knowing why the fuck this ticker messages are coming up, I think is a good example of the kind of like, you know, context that engenders like a postmodern, like memes, you know, that's like where that, so the sense of constant displacement. Right?
Yeah. Is it too much? Should we? I like the Zero's basement ticker.
Ask us more questions. People, the readers need to ask us more questions. Yeah.
Let's see comments.
How many people do we have, by the way, on the
Land called the dialectic double entry bookkeeping and said it couldn't get to zero.
Well, that's just like a Schellingian thing, isn't it? Like.
Then Kersey says, Luke, can you please expand on that? And Luke says no. And Kersey says sad.
Well, I'll expand. I mean, a lot of people think Schelling was like the first like postmodernist, right? Because like I guess postmodernism deals with like the non-encapsulability of the absolute. So Schelling, throughout most of his career, he doesn't really like produce a consistent result. He just kind of circles around this question of like how you can ever start something like dialectic, right? You know, like because like there's like in the logic at the beginning of the logic, like Hegel says like, well, nothing is already interpolated. We could be careful there. Nothing is already interpolated as like a kind of conceptual signifier, right? But then like Hegel kind of glides over that. He's like, well, not a big deal. Which maybe just shows that Hegel thinks, I think like this is Hegel. So Hegel's response would just be like, the night that all cows are black. Like his point would basically like, what the fuck is the point of talking about this stuff that just can't, that's like totally extra conceptual. They can't have any, you know, meaning, right? That would sort of be his response. But he never, you know, it's an ontological question. And so Schelling has that. And then you have people like Kierkegaard that have similar things, and Heidegger. So when Nick Land says that like, and Deleuze is obviously very much in this tradition. So when Land says that the dialectic can't get to zero, that's like, I should clarify that that's very much not a unique Landian observation.
Okay. And the Sternerites are here.
Well, Stirner, no, okay, but Creative Nothing, like Stirner was post Schelling. So I don't think that, I mean, I think Schelling is the first one. I mean, look, this is like this problem.
Schelling is very much
ancient Greece.
The idea like Hegel, though. Like Stirner is like a very negative person compared to Schelling, in terms of Schelling has the idea of the idea in nature and nature logic, that kind of a counter to Hegel. It's an interesting counter to Hegel.
No, but you're talking about early Schelling. You're not talking about the freedom essay and onwards, because you have to stay late and early. Because early Schelling is nature, but and that's the one that influences Hegel in the philosophy of nature. But late Schelling is like a lot more like, I don't know, nihilistic in that way. But that's all before. Like these people like even Feuerbach, who Marx called, I think, an inverted Schelling, like Max Stirner, all these people, like they all knew Schelling's work, and they all needed Schelling's work to actually do what they did, right? And that's not to say like even that they explicitly engaged with it, but I'm saying that climate was already defined by that problem, right? So I don't think Max Stirner is the first postmodernist, but I also think the question of
the Schelling a postmodernist is kind of weird. Yeah, Schelling is not a postmodernist. The German idealist, the idea in the thing. How is Schelling a postmodernist? Would you say?
Well, Greg, do you grasp it? Do you want to respond to that? I could, but I just wanted to distribute.
I haven't read Schelling in like 10 years.
Okay.
He just doesn't seem. He seems like he has like a pretty clear. Oh, the freedom essays you're arguing.
Well, and after that, right? Like ages of the world and stuff. No, I'm like, so basically, like he deals with the problem of how one starts in dialectic. I can't recite all the contents of the freedom essay, but that's like the big problematic of the latter part of his career, right? So it's a critique of dialectic that ends up being absorbed into the climate and affecting all these other people. But like to say someone's the first postmodernist is kind of weird, because it's like I would think
like Diogenes.
Yeah, like the point I would think of postmodernism is more that again that there are and so actually like Lyotard discussed this in the Postmodern Condition, which was commissioned by the Quebec government, by the way. But the actual that was the early separatists, the crazy. But That was he situates it in terms of like the suffusion of our social landscape with like technologies and all like diverse informational contents. So I think the point would be more that like postmodernism isn't just like a philosophical idea. It's actually like a social and cultural landscape, economic landscape, if you want to go to Jameson, in which those ideas acquire hegemony because of that, right? Yeah. Like notions like that have always existed, but like, you know. Okay. Elliot, what are you laughing about? It makes sense.
I switched it to That's Deep, bro. Tell me more.
Oh, I see. Okay, that's why you're cracking up. Okay. Well, that was we actually, you know, Matt and I had to defend his thesis, I guess, but what I participated in of what is postmodern conservatism at HM in London last year, and that was how I defended it, because some people were like, "Oh, like hasn't conservatism always been postmodern?" And I was like, "Well, yes and no, because." Like, you know, in the sense of being critical of like absolute truths or whatever, right? The sort of Enlightenment narrative of rationality. The point would more be about the particular technological and social conditions that conservatism is exposed to today that push it in a certain direction, right? Do you have other questions?
Yeah, we do.
Now we become dependent on these stupid questions.
No, well, we have that. We have why is that? What's the difference between absolute? What is the contradiction? Well, I guess Marx states, you know, they're just different definitions. They're different.
Greg, do you want to hop on that one?
Well, they're different categories. I wouldn't say they're contradictory until so much of one dominates the other, really. But then that ends up being true of just about everything. But for a plain definition, absolute value is what is acquired by extending the working day. So it's just something that is done purely by a lengthening of how much value is produced, whereas relative surplus value is the intensification of the production of surplus value for any given time period.
Yeah. So those, like, we think about in what context would those, like, we'll think about the opposition. Yeah, the opposition is contingent upon the circumstances, right?
Because at a certain point, if relative surplus value gets to such a high point, like the production of relative surplus value is still partially dependent on how much value is being produced for the socially necessary reproduction of laborers. You can't get a really, really strong proportion of relative surplus value without workers being able to relatively easily meet their own needs in a short period of time. So if you look at the ratio of necessary labor in a given workday, if it is a really high ratio of necessary labor, then you have a high cost of living. That's like one index that it shows.
So basically the limit of relative surplus value is, to say this quickly, is like the human physical existence, the point Marx makes. So if you were trying to run a business all on that, you would very quickly run up to limits to productivity that you just couldn't function, right? Greg keeps popping in and out. It's interesting.
Greg says device is not connected.
Device isn't connected. Okay. So I asked you, how many people do we have? Did you tell me that? Like, do we have?
No, I just have the StreamYard link. That we have a good amount of commenters. We have a good amount of probably on different platforms. Okay. I could check. It gives me the annoying feedback loop whenever I check. Usually it just says live viewers.
By the way, to make this very, very clear, if people can see this, you see A, B, and C, yes. Right? So if we're talking about relative surplus value, it's like A to B would be the necessary labor, right, which is here 10 hours, and B to C would be the surplus labor, right, which would be the labor that
on the Facebook we have 13 likes and hearts and 4 shares. It says we've reached at 1,068 people from the Facebook page. And that's just the page, so that's not including the YouTube.
Wouldn't that be bigger than wouldn't that be bigger than the 0 one before?
That's because, look what we got, bro. Bro, I'm lighting this place up like a fucking DJ right now.
Yeah, this is a good example. Elliot is enhancing. Elliot is using technology
Greg's back. Greg's back.
to enhance. Elliot is using technology to enhance. I'm not going to say surplus value, right? Because this is this is more like social reproduction, right? We're grooming you people, right? To better function in capitalist society, right? To raise your education levels so you'll be able to function more efficiently for capitalist employers. Wait till like the "fuck you imperialist" one comes up again. I'm not sure if our irony is fully detected here. Ernesto, do you have any? Ernesto and Revelo, you guys have been a bit less active. Do you have any comments?
I was curious about the contradiction between relative and absolute value. I thought
Surplus
that
value,
surplus value. Yeah, I thought the contradiction might manifest in how when you expand relative surplus value, you end up contracting absolute surplus value. But I'm not sure if maybe I'm not understanding it very well enough.
Well, you end up contracting necessary value production, but you can get both.
Like immediately. Yeah, but like on the long term, doesn't surplus value contract?
Yes and no, but it's an active process, but that process is dependent on other capitalists' actions as well. So if you have, say you take a given market, stick with something that like Marx talks about all the time. If someone's making tables and you've got the average way of producing tables, like there's a dominant mode, and then at the ends, at the one side of the spectrum, one way of doing it is really inefficient, and then at the other end, one way of doing it is far more efficient. The one who's at the far more efficient end will get a production of relative surplus value that's much higher than the average. So as long as they can keep that mode of production under wraps or hidden from other capitalists, then they'll continue to enjoy that extra amount of relative surplus value relative to other capitalist methods of producing it. But as soon as that normalizes across the board, then everybody ends up with a race to the bottom because they all are running at the same level of production, and now you have a new socially average mode of producing it. And then that's when you end up, if it's a sector that ends up contributing, say, to the needs of the reproduction of daily life, then that's going to push down the value of labor. If it's something that's totally ancillary to that, then it could actually end up enjoying a very long run where there isn't a whole lot of pressure to adjust. Okay. But this is also without addressing any market distortions or anything like that, where there's exceptions to everything.
Yeah, you also said relative surplus value. You probably meant to say necessary labor there at the end when you were talking about driving down the...
Yes, yeah, necessary labor.
If modernism is so good, why didn't they make a modernism 2? Well, they did kind of make a modernism 2, which is postmodernism, because all postmodernism
does... That's a really good point.
Yeah, all it does is just relativize the... modernism's already relativistic. It just tries to find, like, situate, like, a node of meaning, right? So you'll, like, you basically, like, rather than having these elaborated kind of rational systems, right, you'll have, like, whether it's, like, power or value or whatever, right? Modernistic or the absolute in Hegel, modernistic thinkers try to find a point that they can kind of make the world's relativistic apparatus spin around. But in postmodernism, like, that point is either, well, that point is obfuscated, right? To try to create more totally relativistic systems. Of course, any philosophical system, you can argue, will still have certain assumptions. But even me saying that would already be sort of postmodern. Yes. Does that make sense?
Modernism too. Annual Jacob says relative surplus value can increase the amount of constant capital advance if people are more productive. They're productively consuming more raw materials.
Yeah, supposing there's consumption demand for it.
Well, no, I think what they're saying, though, what he's saying, though, is that, like, because Marx says, like, constant capital is used up in the process of production, right? So I think what they're saying is that, like, the demands for constant capital can raise in tandem with the consumption of constant capital, right? The using up of machines, let's say, by workers, right? But is that, like, this gets kind of tricky. Like, is that, like, but I think, like, that would be more like labor time, right? That would, under conditions in which you have like a socially necessary amount of labor. That would be labor time that's absorbing, or labor power that's absorbing the value of constant capital, not absorbing, but using up the value of constant capital. It wouldn't be relative surplus value, literally using up the value of constant capital, right? I mean, I ask because like at a certain level of density, it's...
Jesus.
How does he feel about lowercase? I guess he's referring to this all being lowercase.
Lowercase. What does he mean lowercase?
I think this comment is all in
It's a joke.
lowercase.
Oh, how does Marx feel about lowercase?
It's like E. Cummings. No, that's.
Well, this actually has a really good. This actually has a really good. You know, because you know, Marx says capitalism destroys all patriarchal, feudal, idyllic relations. So, like we see in the bourgeois revolution with like, with Robespierre, that like that tu or vous, right? That distinction in French between like the respectful form and the normal form of language, was challenged. So I think Marx, in a certain way, he would see like the elimination of capitalization as a partial consequence of maybe the way that this equalizing tendency manifests in orthography. I don't know.
I'm not familiar with the Robespierre quotes. Can you tell me more about it?
Well, in France, you differentiate between tu and vous, right? Like tu sais compared with vous savez.
Yeah,
right?
like in Spanish, tú and usted.
Yeah, so I understand that when you had the Public Safety Committee and like Robespierre, and when they were really on a roll, kind of revolutionizing, having their bourgeois revolution, it's very violent too, that this was stigmatized to make this distinction. I could be wrong. Someone can get me back, but I think I've read that. So it's a good example of the way that language has changed, right, by these social shifts. There's many examples. Feminist linguists in France really struggle with the masculine feminine, right?
Yeah,
Like
here in Mexico too. We also have gendered language.
Yeah, which, you know, and what is feminism, but in large part, I think, a consequence of women's engagement in the labor force, right? If you look, well, modern feminism, let's say, which is to say what we consider feminism. You know, I mean, that seems to really get going, right, when women are performing, you know, a larger role in production, direct production. I don't mean reproduction. Obviously, women always do stuff.
There was a comment earlier about how capitalism treats people as fixed capital, but there's a more sort of formal elaboration of that. If you think of constant capital being as more of an umbrella, fixed capital would fall under constant capital. You would have buildings and machinery. I'm actually looking at a diagram right now, which is why I'm turning over here. Buildings and machinery would fall under constant capital, as would raw materials in energy or services. But those two would not be fixed capital, but buildings and machinery would. And then living labor power would be considered both circulating capital and variable capital. So constant and variable are not together, but circulating capital can be part of each of those, with constant capital having its own sort of sub-nest of fixed capitals, which is what buildings and machinery would be nestled under. Labor power is pretty much strictly isolated to the realm of variable capital, which also subsumes circulating capital.
Yeah, so that's like the fixed and circulating capital thing has to do with turnover time. Like basic, in the most essential sense, like what good is used up in a certain cycle of production versus what isn't. But Marx refined the terms to constant and variable capital to make a clear delineation between labor power and everything else, right? Which was instrumental to putting forth his thesis about surplus value being the basis of capitalism. So that's from earlier political economists. Like I don't know if that's probably Ricardo. I'm like who originally put that forth.
Well, yeah, what I was including, the diagram I'm looking at is it's being used so that you can show where the classical definitions fit within Marx's definitions.
Yeah, that's good. I always forget, and I wrote a 90,000 word thesis, and I just don't talk about it because I'm too lazy to like look it up and like. But it's also not that important unless you're getting into the historical aspect of it. Structurally, it's not that important. Unless you're trying to show why, like theories of surplus value, unless you're trying to explain why classical political economy fucked up, right? Then you have to kind of dig deep in that, right?
Yeah, it's when you're comparing the one language to the other that it's kind of distinctions become important.
Yeah, I think that's still used in modern economics, right? Though, like fixed and circulating.
I don't know about that. I think, like liquidity
circulating
is usually often, yeah, circulation of like many things, but I think Marx still means it in a pretty unique context.
In the classical model, machines aren't like, if you look at the wages, what is it? Wages, wages. It's the trinity of Smith, right? Rent, wages, profits, right? So like in the classical formulation, machines, Marx points that machines aren't actually factored in, which is a big part of how they're able to think that labor produces its value, is because of like the exclusion of that cost from the actual schema, right? And by the way, Marx's point about, I want to add that Marx's point about like the costs of reproducing labor power are very, very influenced by Ricardo, because Ricardo's like big thing was that he fucking hated landlords, like aristocratic landlords, because he's like, these bitches, they don't produce shit, and they basically like force, like they basically force employer, like he was thinking of it from the standpoint of the employer, but they force us to raise wages to pay higher rents to subsidize the rentier class, which in turn like depresses overall productivity, right? Why do rentiers exist? It's a good question. It's kind of a feudal vestige.
This is probably, I don't know if this is accurate.
Christy, did you get that? Did you get that from Peter Osborne? Because I remember seeing a presentation by him, and he just like put a bunch of words by Marx up on the board, and then he was like saying how many times they've been used. I was like, dude, that's deep. Tell me more, bro.
Oh yeah.
Peter Osborne is like the ultimate of like a guy you gotta do that with. Dude, that's deep. Tell me more. It's part of the value forum school at Kingston University, right? That's where I got my master's. I'm graduated now, so I can make fun of them as much as I want.
Yeah, it's always good to be out of the academic sphere, I feel like.
Well, I still got to finish my PhD, but yeah.
Unfortunate for you.
I'm pretty good. It's in France. I don't really talk to anybody.
That's relative opinion. That's a relative opinion. depending on personal. Kirsty said she counted them herself. She didn't.
Oh, okay.
She went through and she
just open the PDF. Open a PDF and hit Control F. Fine, it'll tell you how many of that.
Yeah, but like, what would you use for that though? Because like Marx's whole works haven't even been translated in English. So like, the only way to get that figure would be to go through like the Mega in German and you find the word for circulation and then Google. You still have to go through all the volumes.
It's better to be sober about how capitalism operates.
Was that a
What's
response?
The argument for being sober? No, that's a response. The person transmits the opinion. No, it's different. But I think it doesn't necessarily need the lead up for the universal principle. It is better to be. Should we not be drunk while capitalism is operating?
Well, what's interesting about that is that like the modern war against alcoholism, like alcohol consumption is related to capitalism, right? And like so
it might be better to be not sober about capitalism.
I don't know if that was Marx's point. We should just get drunk all the time, but yeah, the modern.
Sure.
What does Nietzsche say? Alcohol and Christianity, the two vices of the West. I always like that. But yeah, that like the whole battle against alcohol consumption was very much about that, right? It was about enhancing the productivity of labor. Right?
Does it enhance productivity if you get drunk? Is that that would be a deep capitalism cut.
Probably. I mean, I think it could enhance the productivity of some activity.
Microdosing for labor productivity purposes.
Tech bros.
We'll get on Dustin Murphy next time, and he'll tell you all about microdosing.
It's interesting the way that gets applied to other things, because we tend to contextualize all of our life activities through the prism of value. So if you read pickup artist discourse, like they'll talk about how you shouldn't drink anything because you won't be as funny, or so you should just go talk to as many girls as possible and not get drunk or anything. Maybe have one beer. So it's a good example of how the ethic of capitalism becomes applied to activities which are even extra. I don't know. I was going to say social reproduction, but I don't really feel comfortable putting that in that category right now. So, I mean, people have been getting laid as a part of social reproduction. I don't know if that's weird.
It's literal reproduction.
So abusing people is part of social reproduction. I don't know. Difficult. Probably, right? Yeah, abuse is definitely part of social reproduction, but that doesn't mean it's good. Like, lots of bad things are part of social reproduction.
Please elaborate on that. Let's really get into this one.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so like I'll elaborate. Yeah, so like it's like if you think of the role, like if you look at traditional families, like women work, men work, but men make money. That's the difference, right? So actually maintaining that structure, which was the structure through which like labor was reproduced and value was created, it's like you can't, obviously when you have that kind of systemic segregation, it's going to be necessary to resort to certain forms of abusive behavior in order for it to be maintained that are diffused across society, right? So it's like I think it's not just a question of the fact that in terms of social education and all of this that feminism has happened and that men in certain contexts have become less violent. It would also be the case that that's also a consequence of the fact that there's the economic side, right, where women aren't necessarily in these environments where they're totally dependent on men, right, in terms of the money that they're furnishing, and that would also have a big effect on changing behaviors as well, right? So that's a good example of how abusive behavior becomes, it's very instrumental to the process of social reproduction, right? But you see, like there's plenty of sins that are committed right en route to achieving the organization necessary for social reproduction. Right? So it's not a moral compass, is what I meant to say.
Do we like Luz Irigaray?
Yeah, it's hard to read, but I think it's cool. Like one of my favorite essays is her essay on Antigone. It's in Feminist Receptions of GFW Hegel. That's a real book. Yeah, I mean, I like her. I kind of think her idea is cool of so, I mean, part of it is like trying to identify some kind of, because she's really interested in like the Lacanian formulation, like la femme n'existe pas, right? Which is the idea that like the woman exists sort of as like the inverse of like the male subjectivity, and subjectivity is defined through that prism, right? Elliot, you probably could speak about this more eloquently than myself, but I just want to say that so Irigaray is like trying to explore kind of the subconscious of literature and philosophy to try to find where you could like situate something like a kind of feminine real that's outside of that structural formulation. Right? So it's in that kind of feminist, that school of like you have Kristeva and you have others, but like that school of like feminist interpretation of Lacan, right? Because Lacan isn't necessarily like feminist, but there are, let's say, like feminist suggestions in his work you can kind of exploit to make those points. Yeah.
What about Olenka Zupančič?
Zupančič trouble getting in her, although she's obviously like the Zizek school feminist.
Yeah. Zizek's girl.
I like for Lacanian. I like Kristeva.
You like what?
In terms, I find Kristeva and abjection to be like a important Lacanian feminist concept in terms of you could almost say contra Lacan's hysteria. So the hysteric questions or asks the question, but I think Kristeva sort of develops that like more, talks about it as abjection, which is a more sort of positively framed process, I think you could say, or more like symbolic. So it's like women exist in the symbolic through abjection, in terms of that as its own symbolic rather than a hysteric interpretation of the patriarchal symbolic or whatever you could say.
I haven't read Kristeva, but I've heard really good things. It's interesting.
Yeah. I don't know if you have an opinion of Olenka.
I met Olenka last September, yeah, like it was. I actually really enjoyed her lectures. I saw her lecture with Zizek and Dallaire, and it was her for like Fail Better, which was a summer school they did, and that was where I like basically chased Zizek out of the room to try to get the foreword for our Peterson book, which he eventually he was like, well, I will do it if he gets these idiots to stop bothering me, this kind of thing. But
what idiot? Did you tell him what it was? Did you tell him it was zero books?
Like, yeah. Well, that was actually I think why he did it.
That's
And it
funny.
wasn't so much zero. He like because I told him like it was for zero, and the first thing he asked me, he was like, Nagel. He's like, is she gonna be okay? Is her career over? Like, and I was like, well, every day it's a fight, and
Honestly, I feel like I feel like this impulse to send Zizek stupid things once in a while, just because like I sent him. I wouldn't dare ask him for the forward. So I'm really glad you did that. But I've chosen the route where I prefer like. Anyway, I won't go into it.
To me, that's a one shot. But I just think it was so perfect for the Peterson
cool
book.
though. That was very cool.
Yeah, I think it was really cool for the Peterson book. Like his thing about it, like when I talked to him about it, and I just want to go back to Alenka in a minute. But his thing about so I had to chase him out of the room, and then the next day, I came back again, and he was like, I guess there was one Polish woman he was sort of had this interesting rapport with in the audience, and he was like, okay, well, he's like, I guess if you people are going to keep bothering me, I should meet you. So and then we had a meeting, and I walk in, and he's just like drinking a Diet Coke and eating a cherry pie. Everybody else has beer. First thing I hear, he's like, but Alexandria Cortez is the most fuckable of all the squad, or something.
No, he didn't say that.
Yeah, he did say that. Yeah. Yeah, he said more than Ilhan Omar. Yeah, that is his.
No, he didn't say that.
Yeah. And then we had a good discussion and with some people around. I didn't get to talk much because he mostly goes, And then I asked him about it, and he goes, "Okay, I'll write it forward, but it's just going to be this, self-plagiarized bullshit, right?" And I'm like, "Okay." And then later we wrote him, and it was really tenuous. Like he said, "Oh, I have some problem with my eyes or whatever." And then like it was actually really funny because he's like, "I have a problem with my eyes. I can't do it." And then like I think like the next day he sent us like 20 pages or something, including some new material. So it was like, yeah, but a lot of it obviously sort of rehashed from other places too. But we're very, very happy about that.
Yeah.
Daniel asked a question.
Yeah.
Daniel, let's see. Daniel's question: why does Marx say the real value of a commodity is, however, its individual value than its social value?
I have to think about this. So this is a bit weird, right? Because wouldn't you think that Marx makes a differentiation somewhat like another differentiation in the chapter between individual and social?
Yeah, so the individual value is the value of the commodity as produced by a particular capitalist, but the social value is the amount that it will on average fetch when it's on the market.
Oh, okay.
So the social value is how much it's fetching overall. The individual value is, for example, if it's a really inefficient capitalist production method, its individual value is going to be below social value. Sorry, it's actually reversed because of the way that he defines all these things. But if you can produce something really cheaply, its individual value is far below what the average value is, which is the social value. That's what allows them to get surplus value far and beyond the market average. But if its individual value is far higher, then it doesn't have that room to profit as much as every other capitalist is on average of the same product. So individual value is like the particular. Social value is kind of, it's not the abstract, it's the aggregate of concretes.
So that's a weird nod to supply and demand and the redistribution of the rate of profit in a text that otherwise mostly brackets those concerns. If I'm going off I'm just going on faith on your reading, then that would be like a
down here.
Yeah, it's in the book.
I refuse to believe Zizek said that about AOC. Well, I wasn't trying to out him. He was just joking around,
Yeah, here's a little quote that I have.
I don't think he will get canceled. I mean, I think that's sort of a given. Although they're all
Actually, he looked
wonderful women.
He looped that into a larger kind of feminist comment because he said that.
Did he?
And
what's his larger feminist comment?
Yeah, his larger feminist comment.
I'm ready.
He was just saying that
please off-bung this shit because this shit is some off-bung right now.
Yeah, he basically said that you can see the way that she is sort of criticized in the media because of her status as a younger woman who has somewhat glamorous aura. And he basically said that she has every right to play that up in terms of how she develops her persona because of the way that it's already been weaponized by her political
Well,
opponents.
I feel like he's very tasteful. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, he's vulgar, but he's tasteful.
He wasn't.
Really
There's other
Czechian-
politicians. There's Slovakian prime minister. She's very femme, right?
Well,
She dresses. She has her own customized face mask. She's she doesn't do
I remember that.
She does the.
She had a pink Corona mask. Yeah.
Well, and look at the video of her dancing. That was I think some idiot thought that would discredit her. It was put through the alt-right, and then it turned out to boost her popularity.
People like when people are people.
Well, that's
one of the advantages of socialism is you don't have to put on airs of reactionary class objection, you could say, instead of helping out again. They object themselves and differentiate themselves from,
well, last week,
regular human life.
She was making a margarita last week, and someone tried to
I saw that.
I shame her, and they're and then again the reaction was the same. Wow, she just gets cooler every time they try and do this.
Yeah.
I know. Actually, if she succeeds, it's going to be in the same way that Trump won because of the way in which he was attacked by liberals. If she succeeds, it's going to be because of the way that. Yeah, that'll be why. Greg, you had your notes about social and individual value, right?
Oh yeah. So this is a summarized version of kind of what he's saying about that. But so if you take realizing extra surplus value is kind of dependent on the minutiae of these individual, these particular values. So if we say by doubling the productivity of a given socially necessary mode of production for a particular article or commodity, the same amount of labor is spread over twice the quantity of commodity. Thus, the individual value of each commodity is now well below their social value. Therefore, if he sells it at its real value, that is at its social value, it is sold at double its individual value. But this does require a doubling of the extension of the market in order to support moving that much product. So there is a caveat to how much you can actually make that work. If you're suddenly that much more efficient at producing something, then if you end up overproducing, then you wind up with a crisis of overcapitalization, and then you tank.
Yeah. So that's just a way of talking about the value of commodities before it's been fed through the matrix of socially necessary labor time,
or through supply and demand too, because it's kind of you don't know if it will command that price until it gets to market.
Does he make an explicit allusion to supply and demand though? Because I thought he took it as axiomatic in Capital not to talk about that.
Yeah, he doesn't say it. I don't think he uses any of those terms. Well, he does, I think, say demand, but he doesn't frame it in terms of a reified theory of supply and demand.
Yeah, so this is one of the things about
you have to be able to sell something in order for you to get the value from it. Is the
big objection to Marx's theory of value is once you feed through his theory of value through all these different variables, that actually socially necessary labor time is a really poor index of what any kind of outcome is going to be, which poses, and given that the mathematical formulas don't support any kind of clear transition, the big problem would be what is even the point of this theory of value, which obviously also exists as it's a political thing as well, right? But the question would be, what's the point of this theory of value if it's not even really translatable to actual prices in any way that, well, even I mean, because even looking at obviously social value is much closer to price, right? Than individual value, right?
Yeah.
And that's
his point too. Yeah.
That's why it's confusing why you'd say social value instead of price. That would be, but I mean, it actually would be.
Price is sort of the phenomenal version of social value, if you want to think of it that way.
Yeah. Okay. By the way, Ernesto, do you have anything to say? I don't want to. I hope you're not getting annoyed. I know you haven't been as active, but.
No, I was. I have the quotes right here of where he says demand. So he says, hence, in order to get rid of the products of one working day, the demand must be double what it was, i.e. the market must become twice as extensive. Other things being equal, the capitalists' commodities can only command a more extensive market if their prices are reduced. He will therefore sell them above their individual but below their social value, say at 10 pence each. By this means he still squeezes an extra surplus value of 1 penny out of each. This augmentation of surplus value is pocketed by the capitalist himself, whether or not his commodities belong to the class of the necessary means of subsistence, and therefore participate in determining the general value of labor power. Hence, quite independently of this, there is a motive for each individual capitalist to cheapen his commodities by increasing the productivity of labor.
Yeah, so that's a good reference to it. And he's using that reference, like he's not talking about supply and demand in such an abstract way. It's quite eminent to this process. He's just talking about the way that like you have to find a larger market for goods if you're producing more, right? To actually capitalize on super profits, I guess, right? Super profits referring to the profits that are yielded as a consequence of having like a unique access to more efficient machinery, for example.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, Elliot, somebody's put up that thing. There's someone threw up something about Marx and supply and demand. Can you throw that back up?
Previous political economists say Chapter 4 of Wealth of Nations already approached value when supply equals demand. This is why Marx follows.
Yeah,
Except
so Marx
he doesn't, though.
And he says
Yeah.
that's Chapter 5.
Well,
Not Chapter 4.
I was just going to say that he does it axiomatically in Capital, but he does actually acknowledge that there's a, like, he criticizes Say for saying supply is demand, JB Say. So he knows that the two are disconnected, but he in Capital, he just wants to try to simplify the analysis, which is dialectical in a sense.
Well, this is still the very beginning of what the theorization will be. Like, he's still bracketing out all kinds of other concerns so that we can get to that point with everything clarified beforehand.
Yeah, by the way, you can't actually understand this stuff unless you read all volumes and the Grundrisse. Just want to be clear. Like,
And then you have to
problem
go
is-
back and read it again.
Yeah,
Then you have to read it
early
backwards.
Marx.
And you have to do it while standing on your head.
Retrospective learning.
You don't have to
Yeah, you
stand
really have to.
for
You have to invert. Yeah, like Marx's inversion of Hegel. You literally have to invert yourself to better understand the text.
Yeah, you have to read just like Marx turned Hegel on your head. You have to stand on your head.
But the reason for that, the reason
up there.
for that is because of the way that. By the way, I wanted to say, Elliot,
do that.
earlier you asked
Don't
a question
actually
about,
do that. Just in
earlier you
case.
asked a question about
Yeah,
the
one
relationship of all
person
this to
takes
praxis.
it.
You earlier asked about the relationship of all this to praxis, and I just wanted to say that in the International Working Man's Association, there was like a division. So you had the division turned around the labor, like Marx's labor theory of value, which is more of really a value theory of labor. But okay, Dan Elson, thank you. But okay, in the there was a division in the International Working Men's Association, and I think I could be mistaken. Like it was like you had an anarchist side with like Proudhon and Bukharin, and then you had like the Marxist side, and then you had a more reformist side, which was more social democratic or proto-social democratic. And I forget, I want to say Lassalle, but I could be wrong. But basically, the argument over the whole economic context and the Marxian labor theory of value was crucial to that, because like the anarchists just didn't believe in this at all, but they also didn't understand it. So I think a lot of the anarchists, they wrote stuff like, oh yeah, well, if I do like 4 hours of work, that doesn't create like value, so Marx is wrong, which just doesn't understand what he's even saying, right? That's like the most like, dead stupid level kind of criticism. And that was why also that was why the anarchists that was part of why they didn't agree with the proletariat as like the universal class, was because they objected to this. Then you had Marx, who argued that like you have socially necessary labor time, and like all this sort of analysis of capital. But Marx's point, and this is very clear when you get in the third volume, is that capitalism cannot persist indefinitely, right? That there's an ultimate like death knell to capitalism. It can extend its longevity, and it certainly extended in ways that would have been, I think, quite shocking to Marx, but that it can't persist indefinitely. Then on the more social democratic side, you had people who thought like, well, they didn't see the way that like the falling rate of profit and the change in the organic composition of capital would ultimately damage capitalism or cause it to end. So they thought you could actually, have capitalist expansion or something like that within the context of, improving the quality of life of laborers, right? So it's a very, very political argument, which we sometimes forget when we read Marx's stuff, that, all these interventions, he's very conscious of the political fault lines when he makes, and that's, again, the value form in Marx is also very, very political, in terms of how he's using it. right?
As opposed
So
to strictly economic, is what you mean.
Well, yeah,
So
it's both.
we're at like an hour and 40 minutes. Maybe we should wrap this up.
Do you want to go till 10? Because I wrote 3 hours in the thing just in case, but I think we should get 2. Just do you want to go till 10? Or till, I guess for you it would be what? It would be
To 1.
4, right? Do you want to go till 4?
Any particular reason to do that? Do you have 20 minutes of things to say right now?
I probably do.
Okay, go for it. Okay, Conrad.
It's just me now. I just want to make it 2 hours, so it's 2/3 of the length that I wrote in the Facebook event.
No, that's. I mean, That's okay. we could do that. Sure.
Anybody, Greg, Ernesto, do you have any thoughts?
I like this little caveat that, like, Marx is always adding caveats whenever he's explaining something, but I thought this one was good, where he says that general and necessary tendencies must be distinguished from their forms of manifestation. So when he's saying, like, value operates this way and things like that, like, it's not going to be necessarily applicable to a particular example or even able to be applied to a particular example. Sort of like you have to abstract beyond what the examples concretely given are in order to arrive at what he means when he's saying these things.
Yeah, well, and like the notion of tendency is more scientifically theorized within the context of like sort of like structural Marxism in France, like in the 60s and 70s, like Althusser and Balabar. And I'm not like, I don't feel qualified to offer a really thorough summary of that at this time, but I do think that it's really important in the sense that a lot of the problematic readings of Marx you see, it seems to me that they emerge because people will take something that is portrayed as explicitly tendential in its analysis and take it out of context. So for example, like the subsistence theory of wages is a good one, where people will be like, well, capitalism is supposed to like depress worker wages, and it's like, well, like, I think Marx's point would more be that, like, in an ideal context in which you don't account for a bunch of other variables, that's going to be the outcome, right? But like when, even if you start to get in like, proletarian activism or whatever, and it's going to change whatever the outcome is, right? So, and that's actually, I'm amazed by how bad the criticisms of Marx are by modern neoclassical political economy. Like, I don't know if you've ever read stuff like this, but like often I read stuff, I don't know, be published on like the Adam Smith Foundation's page or something, like some seemingly prestigious academic institution, and they'll just miss, like, you'd think these points that are kind of important, like before you're going to put something on some big fucking website, like, well, I don't know.
Marx forgot about human nature.
Proudhon sided with living labor, social democrats with capital, says Daniel.
Well, that's kind of a weird formulation though. Like, cause like that's like a simple formulation, but like, it's like Proudhon sided with living labor. It's like, okay, like, I guess he was an anarchist. I mean, that's what he did. That's what anarchists do.
Are you lot in the comments tankies? Says Kirsty.
Can we say whether we're tankies? Yes.
The anarchists learned me the world of tankies, so I don't know if it's correct.
Well, they learned you that. They learned you that.
Thoughts?
Well, okay, my
thoughts on the.
Yeah, maybe why we're organizing this separately is, I don't know exactly, but I think one thing was, like, before there were some arguments in our group. I think for me, I have like kind of a value form reading of Marxism, but I don't think of it like I don't take the Postonian stance that like that oh well, like proletarian activism hasn't worked, right? Worker, like, kind of traditional Marxism has failed and so on. For me, like, the actual proletarian struggle, and I think this is clear if you read through Marx in enough depth, it's actually imminent to the self-development of the value form, right? And can be very, very decisive in terms of how that expresses itself politically. So I don't think of it as like an absolute dead end in that sense. That having been said, I do have the kind of same broad structural reading. So I mean, like, I can certainly see the social logic in, I mean, it's like about the Stalinist USSR. It's like there's always two ways of looking at this. It's like you have the Trotskyist critique, like, oh yeah, socialism in one nation becomes fascism. And it's like, okay, well, that is kind of true. Like, the Soviet Union did become, like, I'm not saying fascist, but it did become like this horrible authoritarian state. Then Stalin's point was like,
oh, go on. Sorry.
But Stalin's point was like, well, we need to like focus on building, we'll fail if we try to extend this project at this time. We need to focus on building socialism in Russia. And then later we can go and spread it elsewhere. And, you know, if you look at Cuba, Vietnam, Algeria, the huge strides that were made in the Soviet Union and its defeat of Nazi Germany, I think Stalin was right about that too. So I think these people are smart enough that it's not about, you know, this is right or this is wrong, right? It's about kind of seeing the historical totality. I don't think that, you know, Stalinism is just like a psychological defect or something. I think there are very, very palpable reasons for why that happened, right? And good and bad sides, right, for that matter. Anyone else? Anyone else want to weigh on that? Are you a tanky?
Are you a tank? That's such. What is it? I think it means you generally support Marxism, Leninism, right? But you draw a distinction between, say, China. What's the distinction between China and the USSR for you?
Well, I mean, I think that, and maybe does anyone, like, if anyone else wants to weigh in on any of these questions, I don't want to just like Ernesto or Greg or anyone. Do you guys have anything?
Sure.
Well, locally, a lot of the organizations here are Marxist-Leninists, and it's the same thing around pretty much entire Latin America. So, but I don't really enjoy how they seem to really fixate on whether we're doing exactly what Lenin, Mao, and Stalin said we should do, and if we aren't, we are not welcome in the club. You know, I appreciate that they work a lot and that they move a lot of people, but I don't think that we should always be focusing on what we should have done in the past and on defending the mistakes of the past.
Well, also to displace them as universal principles, you know, which is like precisely what you're not supposed to do with Hegel.
Yeah.
Anything Hegelian is like displace the context and universalize something rather than looking at the Volkgeist in idealist form or the material conditions in the Marxist form. You know, either way, you shouldn't just try to universal. I suppose you could test it as a universal principle, but then to go ahead and give yourself the go ahead to simply copy paste like Stalin ideology or something.
Yeah.
Like, what would be the point?
Sure, yeah, I don't oppose testing it as a principle, but, you know, total devotion to it.
Well,
Not...
total devotion is antithetical to communism in general, which is a process of critique. Hypothetically, you know, but it's to what extent is that, to what register does that critique register at? Because if it's a state like China says they have a method of critique, but then, you know, the Leninist idea is you then, once the party decides that one, you don't necessarily critique the party in public, right? So you don't actually have the process of critique at hand, you know, you could say at the grassroots. I mean, let me flash my Bernie pen. And then say,
I think I want to. I just want to.
What about the grassroots people who want to critique? Can you imagine if somebody tried to tell Bernie supporters that they had to get in line with the party line? Oh my God, what a mess!
You guys have already been conditioned by America, but what?
Yeah,
I'm not saying that's bad. Good. But what I wanted to get at was that like, I think you're confusing kind of two levels of like, because you're talking about like, it's kind of an Enlightenment reading, like, so like alienation in Lacan, sort of Zizek, it's kind of displaced onto like, you know, the process of signification itself, right?
Yeah.
You know, and the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. But like, I think the point for Marx would be that like, you know, that the process of alienation is defined by certain social conditions, right? Like certain social phenomena that are widespread. So if you're going to try to change that, right, like it's not the same thing as like, you know, and this is coming out of like Hegel and Hegel's philosophy of right. It's not the same thing as like, you know, every individual saying their own opinion, right? Like there's no like, you know, the individual does not have an ontological status like that in the work of Marx, in the mature work, right?
Do you think a major flaw of Leninism is that lack of free speech on a basic interpersonal level, in absolute free speech?
No, I think probably that's a condition of its success would be more my take. I think probably, again, I think free speech is like, I mean, free speech, first of all, even in our society, it's not distributed equally or anything. And I think Marx even makes this point.
But I mean, you can say a bunch of crazy shit and not get arrested. So that is
Yeah, okay, so there's some
You
kind of
know.
but that's not free speech functions differently for someone who owns like a news network, you know, so it is often contingent on wealth.
It's true. There's capitalized free speech in terms of free speech then turns into capitalist propaganda. At its highest form, like capitalism, free speech in its highest form is capitalist propaganda, you could say, right? Like capitalism in its highest form is imperialism.
Yeah, Breitbart, the highest stage of free speech. But,
It is.
yeah,
In the
really,
Hegelian sense, capitalist, propagandized speech that's funded by massive amounts of capital that influences the way millions of people think, right? That's a pretty Hegelian, I would say, outside form of free speech than me saying like the government sucks and not getting arrested, right?
The point is that
because you can't do that in China.
Free speech is a luxury of a situation where like the first thing that they did in the American Revolution was they were like, do you agree with our like basic, you know, revolutionary democratic principles? And they're like, if not, get the fuck out of the country, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that free speech already presupposes like a sufficiently unified social field that it can be permitted, like, you know, as something that exists in a controlled environment in that setting. So obviously, if we're talking about movements like, you know, like what happened in China or what happened in Russia, those are just very, very different environments. And it's kind of a rhetorical wedge of the West to say like, oh, these people are horrible, they don't permit free speech. But this would this ignores like the history through which the conditions in which free speech exist in the West were created, which did not involve free speech, right? Derrida in Voyou, he gives a good example of this in the election in Algeria, where they opened up, like in Algeria, they tried to democratize in the 90s. And then the party that was going to win was an anti-democratic, like sort of Islamic party. So then they canceled the election in order to preserve democracy. That was their rationale for doing so.
Democracy in its highest form, which is the Western ideology, imperialist ideology, right? Well, that's the reading, which is you could argue that individual free speech is less important than removing capital influence on general discourse.
Well, or that, yeah, I think the leftist argument would have to be that you know, like the limit, like the structure of what we call free speech would have to change to try to because right now it's just so lopsided in terms of how capital kind of dominates that field. So I don't really consider like a Western style endorsement of free speech even
free speech
overly compatible, like the way they define this, right? Not as a kind of normative or kind of regulative ideal, but the way it's defined, I don't really even consider compatible with achieving the goals of socialism. You know, and it's funny how this works. Like in my province in Ontario, at some point the Conservative government banned all labor organizations or individuals from owning newspapers. So like only corporations could. And then they found a loophole that allowed like a not-for-profit organization to run the Toronto Star. But the point is like the rules of this, we like to talk about free speech in the blanket sense, but the rules of it are constantly adjusted. If you're in a left-wing government, why not ban like capitalists or like capitalist enterprises from owning newspapers? Would that be anti-free speech? I'm sure they would say it is, right? I'm sure you'd be assailed for doing that.
Well,
but
that'd be that's an interesting idea. All papers. Yeah, I don't think the power, because they are the highest form, that means they have a high amount of power behind them in terms of like you can never pass a law requiring these networks to become, I don't know, nonprofit or state owned. I don't know. What would you even say?
Well, that would be, I think what you'd want is you'd want a mix of state media and like not-for-profit organizations or like co-ops or whatever. Like that's the kind of thing that you would want to create, right? Maybe there could be some marginal role for capital to play in that context in a transitional form. But I'm just saying, like, this is why I don't like blanket endorsements of like humanism, you know, when they're presented alongside like a Marxist viewpoint, is because I think they don't think through some of the contradictions and how these things are applied to an adequate degree, right? Like it might sound good, but you know, it's like, what is humanism? What does that come from? How is it used? Right? Like, you know, it doesn't ask enough questions for me, really. Which, by the way, is not the same thing as saying, and here's the superego, is not the same thing as saying that I'm anti-human.
You're anti-human? I'm anti-human,
Covering his ass.
pro-robot, and
Yeah.
pro-bird.
I've done that a few times.
I like birds and robots. My perfect future. Just gotta say, there's definitely gonna be birds and robots. I don't know about people.
Robot bird. Actually,
robot birds, absolutely robot birds. Definitely.
My favorite comment recently on this was Dugin, the Russian guy, who said that.
What did Dugin say? What was Dugin?
And he writes like the best neo-reactionary articles, right? For this, like the best in this genre of bullshit. But he said that he uses this, like he's developed his own meaning of the word OOO, like object-oriented ontology. And he said OOO is like preparing, it's like grooming humans for like the inevitable extinction they face in the wake of like mass like automation and so forth. And I kind of looked at it, I'm like, yeah, it's okay, that's fair. Like, yeah, I want to make one other note here about capital. It's one thing I forgot to bring up. At one point, Marx says something really Spinozist, right? He says that a scientific analysis of competition is possible only if we can grasp the inner nature of capital, just as the apparent motions of the heavenly bodies are intelligible only to someone who is acquainted with their real motions, which are not perceptible to the senses. So this is like, you can see when you read stuff like that, how Althusser kind of gets his like works in like the Spinozist structuralist reading of Marx. Because like, you know, for Althusser, like the big problem is like that people have tended to read Marx as an empiricist. Do you have that page, Ernesto?
Looking for it.
Okay, let me pull that up again. Chapter 12, right?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, we just bridged a section. Okay. Let me see. Yeah, it's 433 in the second paragraph, not the third, but it's near the bottom of the page. Yeah. So you can see how Althusser kind of works that into you know, that like, you know, you need to have like a Marxist theory, right? Because like, you know, and his big critique is that like traditionally Marx is read like an empiricist, and he's like, but that's not Marx's point. Marx's point is that like the actual structure of these things is not apparent, right, within the context of visibility. But you could also argue that's a Hegelian point, obviously, like at the level of the logic, or like it's not a phenomenological manifestation, like in the phenomenology of spirit.
What is evident doesn't make sense until you already know the laws determining it.
Yeah, like the point of the logic is like that, like you have to discard like the notion that like truth can be found.
Formative.
Yeah, truth isn't found in phenomenality. Well, it's a ladder that has to be there, but like you need like the hermeneutic tools of logic in order to actually access truth, right? So there's a Hegelian and a Spinozist way of approaching that, but and that's why everyone attacks Althusser for being like a theoreticist, is the word they use, because they argue that like Althusser assigns this like, you know, mystificatory and religious importance to like the Marxist intellectual because of the role that one has to play in kind of engaging in this process of mapping, or right, kind of, you know, portraying these structures, right, which is Rancière's big critique.
Bit of an ego loop there. 15 comments, I haven't been keeping up. Someone said, "Draw Marx soy."
Yeah, I'm a soy boy. I am actually drinking as much soy as possible to feminize myself, so that I'll better understand the social reproduction of labor. Okay. The next question. question.
Yeah, soy is going to grow into great man. Oh, check out meme analysis. Sure, absolutely. Humanism. Okay.
I don't know what social capital is. That's like a really un-Marxist term.
It's Bourdieu, isn't it?
Is what?
It's Bourdieu.
Bourdieu has cultural capital. Does Bourdieu say social capital? I thought it was like just
social capital is like a sort of secular term.
Yeah, that was like a late capitalist kind of term. I think humanism just arises from the universality of wage labor, right? Would be my take on it, and the necessity of surplus value extraction. Thus, the instrument played by humans.
Why don't we go to one last question before we cut it, because we're at 1:58.
Okay.
It says, "Filthy anarchy here. What are your thoughts of? What are your thoughts on the role of the state in the production of a better society?" The same as Marx's view, and then we've kind of covered that a bit in terms of what Marx's view of the state is.
Same as Marx, necessary transitional role.
Necessary transitional role.
Dialectical obstetric.
It'd be interesting to look at China through that lens in terms of it's like China equals bad because where it is on free speech now, but you can look at it as a dialectical transition to something else. It'd be interesting to see where China is. It's going to be rough because there's a big event. There's a big event coming up for China, which is Hong Kong becoming the PRC, and there's obviously two totally different geists there. There's Hong Kong, which is pro-free speech, like Western free speech in general, liberal democracy. I wonder how that will help China, even though it seems like right now China sees Hong Kong as basically a problem. But I wonder how I wonder if the seed of Hong Kong will improve. And I actually have footage from Hong Kong going there, and I'll definitely be releasing that soon here. But in terms of what's happening with the protests, I wonder what the dialectical meaning of this contradiction within China between the protesters and the Chinese government is going to come, what is going to result. Not even necessarily that we have the answer yet, but I wonder what's going to come of it with some time passing. And with the transition of Hong Kong into not a sort of special district, but actually China proper. And they have a 50-year from 97, so it's 47. 2047, we're going to have another crisis. I would say a corona-sized crisis for Hong Kong in terms of it will shake them. It's going to change. I don't know. I think it will be a very big sort of reckoning. I wonder what will happen.
I suspect it shows how much the Chinese Communist Party is dependent on the idea of like the Chinese people as like a collective political subject, who are happy with the role the government plays also in raising the living standard and continuing to do so in areas that are less developed.
This is good. It's all good.
Yeah, but when you're disconnected from that, like Hong Kong, was developed much earlier, and after it stopped being like a white supremacist state in the 70s, right, there was a really rapid process of like economic development and democratization. So if you don't conceptualize yourself as part of that broader political subjectivity, you can see how if you're in an urban area that's like highly developed, you might just get fucking pissed, right?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
But I think it also shows you the importance of the perception of growth and success in that domain to suppressing these concerns. We should note with interest that Tiananmen, which was more threatening in some ways because Tiananmen, like the Hong Kong protests are they're very particularist and chauvinistic regional elements in it. It's not all like that, but that's one thing.
You only need a couple people like that to quote unquote define it like that. But sure is that. So I also think the signifiers are totally different there. Like they sell like Pepe stickers, which are general protester stickers. I don't necessarily think they mean like Trump Pepe. It's totally different. Like the meme signifiers are repurposed. So I'm not quite sure it's a chauvinistic. There are some elements. There are definitely. I'm just saying some elements. I think it's substantial, but I think there's another substantial and more universal aspect. Yeah. But the point is, like, people in China are very skeptical about that, and there's a lot of resentment in China. I mean, I've talked to Chinese people who, say they don't like Hong Kong because you know how it goes in Hong Kong. Like, you have the hierarchy. It's like white people, Cantonese, Chinese, like Indian, low-wage laborers, right? That's basically like the hierarchy there. So, I think even like people who are, let's say, relatively successful from the PRC, sometimes they resent the culture of Hong Kong because they feel that they're condescended, But I mean, Tiananmen Square was in many ways more threatening because Tiananmen Square did take on a more, it identified more with the collective subjectivity of the Chinese. And there's it's like, look at Jackie Chan, like he was like all about Tiananmen, but now he's like, I'm going to go kick anyone's ass who defaces a PRC flag in Hong Kong. Is he? Is he like that now? I haven't heard him talk about it. It's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and it just shows you, I guess what I'm saying is we should note with interest that Tiananmen happened at a time when the Chinese system was somewhat fragile because of the collapse of global socialism and the transition. But now, like the transition to like this like Dengist or post-Dengist model has been like really thoroughly implemented, right? So, you don't have that same fragility, I think, at the collective level.
Yeah. Okay. Why don't we end it there?
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Yeah,
I think this went well. I like this format. I'm gonna end the broadcast. So.
Okay. All right.
Greg,
bye, everyone.
Conrad, Ernesto.
Thank you guys. thank you. Thanks, Greg.
Elliot
Thanks,
here.
Ernesto. Thanks, Elliot.
Thank
And
you.
we'll be
Thank
back,
you,
guys.
everyone.
We'll be back next week, and we'll be reading. Can we just go over what we're going to read? Can we just map that
Yeah,
out
sure.
here?
Sure.
Because I think it'd be good for people watching. Also, they know we have to gauge the length of the next chapter, right? If it's doable in one shot or not.
It's pretty short.
So, is 13 short?
Yep. It's
Okay, yeah, it's not bad, right? It's like, how many do we have? 439
14 pages.
454. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so and this always capital works, right? It's like you have like 8-page, 13-page, 9-page, then like 110
Yeah.
pages. Like so next week we'll be coming back and we'll be discussing, what's the name? Chapter 13. What's the name of chapter 13?
cooperation.
We'll be cooperating here to discuss chapter 13, cooperation. So again, if anyone wants to hop on with us, we'll put up the link in the group and the event page that we put on the group anyway. But otherwise, we'll be here and you can watch. Thanks, guys.